Welcome to Anatomy and Physiology 1. This is the first course of 2 classes that you're going to be taking in preparation for your nursing courses. AP1, primarily anatomy, little tiny bit of physiology. AP2, the exact opposite. So I kind of say, AP1, 80% anatomy, 20% physiology. AP2, 80% physiology, 20% anatomy. So, get prepared for the changes. So first of all, when we talk about anatomy and physiology, we have to look at some of the origins of the science itself. When we talk about going back in history, Greek and Roman times, they felt that you got sick because you got bad humors. Through the years, we learned a little bit more, but basically those early healers, superstition, magic, you breathe something really strange, whatever. What they didn't realize that when you were breathing something strange, you were actually breathing in organisms that would cause you to get sick. We start getting into the Age of Enlightenment. We get past those Middle Ages and into the Ages of Enlightenment, and you're talking about people beginning to make observations of injuries, observations of actually cutting bodies open, looking at the inside, finding out what's going on. So you start to see the beginnings of what is really truly medical science. And they start experimenting. This is the age, and you get into the 16, 17, 1800s, you've got this golden age of learning what organisms cause what diseases, what we can do, that sort of thing. So you're starting to put all this information together to hopefully get where we are now. Vesalius is very famous for his illustrations. He made them from dissections, and you can see this is 1600s and 16th century, I should say. And he has a whole group of them, and they're just absolutely beautiful drawings. But this is really one of the first people that actually did those detailed illustrations of what the body looked like. Okay? So when we talk about anatomy and physiology, and I said we're going to have a certain percentage of this, anatomy is the study of the structure. What does it look like? What are the names of the muscles? What are the names of the bones? What is the bone constructed of? That sort of thing. So it's the pieces and the parts. The physiology is how does everything work? So that's why when you're doing anatomy, you're memorizing the parts and the pieces and the names and the terminology. And when you're doing physiology, you're talking about how do things work? How does the heart actually move the blood through the body? How do the hormones tell the body what to do? So it's a totally different philosophy in terms of looking at this stuff. You put it all together, and that's what you're studying for anatomy and physiology. Okay, so one of the first things we have to look at is these levels of organization. All materials are composed of chemicals. You can have non-living and living, but everything is made up of atoms. These atoms are, if you've had any kind of chemistry, made up of these subatomic particles, your neutrons, your electrons, your protons. We'll look at that in the next chapter. And you'll look at how that atom is constructed. We'll be looking at the molecules when you start to put these atoms together, and then you get these bigger molecules, and they're macromolecules, and we'll start talking about the different macromolecules that are important for the body, like the carbohydrates and the lipids and the proteins. And then we'll start looking at the cell itself. That's our chapter number 3, where you're looking at that basic structure of the cell and the organelles within it that allow that cell to function the way it should. And then we start to get into the organization of the body and your cells. All the cells that work together make up a tissue. So you have a layer or a mass of cells with a specific function. and that's called a tissue. So we have, as an example, adipose tissue, fat. You may have some other kind of tissue. We're going to go through that. There's many different kinds of tissues, and you're going to be expected to know them and to identify them. You take a group of different tissues and you put them together with a common function, and you have an organ, like a heart or a kidney, intestinal tract, brain. And then you have a organ system where you put all those organs together to come up with a common function, like digestive, cardiovascular, urinary system, that sort of thing. And then all of those all together make up the whole organism. Okay, so that's our level of organization, from the smallest to the full organism. All right. Now the atoms and the molecules, they're not living. Okay. But when we start to get over here, we're talking about living tissue. This is just an atom. It could be an atom of iron. That's not a living thing. Okay, so we'll look at that a little later on. So when we look at A&P, we're talking about the cell. We're talking about that internal environment of the body and trying to maintain that environment. That's called homeostasis. We want a basically fairly consistent internal environment. That doesn't mean everything stays exactly the same, because a lot of these things will go up and down during the day, like your sugar levels. They change. But we want to maintain these components within a certain range. And all these cells are dependent on each other. You can't move a muscle without your nervous system working. All right? You can't pump blood through the heart if you don't have a bone marrow that's working well enough to make blood cells. So the different organ systems depend on each other. What we're going to find, especially when we look at tissues, is that the structure and the function of these are interrelated. You can't take a little tiny cell and expect it to secrete a whole bunch of hormones or secrete a whole bunch of stomach acid to digest that Thanksgiving dinner. It's just not going to work. So we have these cells that are basically made for the function that they're supposed to do. You know, if you didn't have a muscle cell with a connection that allows the nerve conduction to go through the cell very, very quickly, your heart would be pumping different areas, you know, at different times. But because of the structure of that cardiac muscle and that connection that you're going to learn is called an intercalated disc, those nerve impulses flow through that tissue very, very, very quickly, and the heart contracts together. So the structure and the function does make a difference. Okay. So if we look at cells, these are what we consider to be the smallest units of life. Anything below that is not really living. It's an element. But when we start to talk about a cell, that is a living structure. All right. And you can have free living single-celled organisms. Most plants and animals are multicellular. We're made up of billions of cells. Some, like us, trillions of cells. But you only have about 200 different types of cells. We'll talk about this. They do measure in different sizes. Generally, we're going to talk about a micrometer or micron, as most of us in the science call it. And some of these are going to vary in size in terms of some are very, very, very tiny. Little tiny cell, whereas you may have a nerve cell that goes down several feet. So you've got a lot of variation there in size. The function is related to the structure, as I mentioned. So we've got, for example, these smooth muscle cells, these long, slender cells that we're going to look at for contraction because we're having to, for example, do peristalsis, move the food through the gut, that sort of thing. Your red blood cells, they lose their nucleus and they flatten out, so that when that cell goes into that lung and goes into the alveoli of the lung, that oxygen and that carbon dioxide can exchange very, very, very quickly. Bone cells, very strong, lots of calcium, lots of phosphorus in it to make that bone hard so that it can maintain your height. I mean, you get your structure because of that hardness of that bone. So when you look at that, these cells, their function is very much related to the type of structure that they do have. Now, if you were an alien and you came down to Earth and you're trying to decide if something is living or not, you're going to look at some things, and there are some things that generally tell us that yes, this is a living organism, or no, this is a rock and it isn't living. All right, and some of those that we notice is growth. And growth in numbers, growth in the size. You know, some organisms just get bigger and then divide. Some of us, grow in height through our lives, and then so we get an increase in cell number and in size, but we're changing some way that we're increasing that body size, that growth. I haven't seen too many rocks grow. All right. Reproduction. You have to be able to make the new generation. All right, so this is production of somehow of new cells, new organisms, whether it's by something like binary fission, you just divide into two, or you're a human and you do sexual reproduction. So you've got to produce that next generation. Another one that we look for is responding to something, responding to a stimulus, and that's called responsiveness. You have a change of some kind, some stimulus that changes either inside or outside, and your body makes some response to it. For example, your sugar goes down, and your body is going to start pumping sugar into the bloodstream to compensate for that. So it's responding to that change in the environment. Movement. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean you got to be able to get up and walk. Plenty of organisms are alive, but they don't move. I mean, a tree, well, I haven't seen a tree get up and walk anytime too soon, but it just means motion may be internally. If you look inside that tree, it's pumping water up and down that trunk out to the leaves, that sort of thing. So there is movement occurring. For us that are modal, that makes it a little bit easier for us because we are changing body position, we are changing location, but we are also moving food through our gut. We are moving air when we breathe, that sort of thing. All right, metabolism. We're going to look at a whole chapter on metabolism, but this is how we stay alive. We do chemical reactions, and the sum of all those reactions is called metabolism. We have to have energy. We have to take in nutrients, and it's those chemical reactions that allow us to actually be alive. We also require oxygen in some way, particularly us aerobic organisms. We need oxygen to do metabolism because we are an aerobic organism, but it helps us make this energy. We're going to talk about this in another chapter, but most organisms take in oxygen, give off carbon dioxide through these chemical processes. We have to be able to break down food. We have to be able to take that food. I don't know about you, but if you eat a turkey dinner, that doesn't go into the body in that form. So we have to be able to break down all that turkey and break down those mashed potatoes and gravy and put it into a usable form that then the body can readjust for whatever it needs. We need to have some kind of circulation. We have our blood system, our cardiovascular system moves that stuff around. We have our blood vessels, and so we're moving chemicals, we're moving hormones, that sort of thing throughout the body. So we're making sure that the body is getting the nutrients it wants, getting the oxygen and carbon dioxide exchanged, but we're moving things around. And because of all that, we're making waste products. And so we have to have a system to get rid of those. All right. So some of the things we absolutely have to have in terms that we consider requirements for living organisms are the basics: water, food, oxygen, heat, pressure. Okay. Water, most requirement. Even your little tiny bacteria have to have water. All right. We have to have it for metabolic processes. We have to have it to move things in our body. Our blood is mainly water. We use water to regulate our body temperature. We sweat. When we sweat, we release heat. So water is extremely important. Without it, we dehydrate. We don't survive. Most of us, we've already talked about food. We have to have food to provide energy. And we have to have oxygen because it provides, again, we're going to do aerobic respiration. If we are going to make the most ATP, we'll talk about that a little bit later on in the course, we need that oxygen because it helps us release food, energy from the food. All right, it's a process that we're going to look at, and it helps us do that. Heat, it is a form of energy. It helps us maintain body temperature. It controls our metabolic reactions. So if we talk about maintaining body temperature, most of us know that we are warm-blooded animals, and because of that, we maintain our temperature at a set point. Cold-blooded animals can work around that a little bit, but even them, if they get too cold, if they get too hot, they've got problems. But what we're trying to do is maintain that body temperature in that zone that we need so that our enzymes work properly, our metabolic processes work properly, and so that's part of controlling the metabolic rate. The higher the temperature gets, the faster the reactions get. And we run into problems that if temperature gets too high, then proteins can do what we call denature and they won't work anymore. And if we get too cold, we get hypothermia and things begin to shut down. So having that consistent body temperature is important for us. Pressure is also important. You need a certain amount of atmospheric pressure. We'll talk about that when we get to respiratory system in AP2. But you breathe by dropping the diaphragm and making a vacuum inside your thoracic cavity, inside your chest. That allows the air to flow into your lungs. If you don't have that change in pressure, you're not going to be able to breathe. Okay, so the fact that we're monitoring and looking at atmospheric pressure is very important in terms of breathing. We need hydrostatic pressure. This is water pressure. We have to keep the blood flowing. And if pressure drops, things stop flowing. If your blood pressure crashes, your kidneys stop working. So because they're a filter system. So the pressure behind certain membranes and that sort of thing become very important. Again, this is stuff that we'll get into in AP2. So what the body does is it tries to do what we call homeostatic regulation, keeping things at a set point that we want it to be. And we have several components to that. We have a receptor, we have a control center, we have an effector. And I say effector because it's actually effector, but we have affectors and effectors, and sometimes I say E and A because it makes you realize what it is. But you have a sensor. Okay? You have a receptor. You have some kind of sensory receptor in your skin or on an organ that is sensing a change to the environment. Okay? You have sensors in your heart. You have sensors in the neck of your, up here on the, what we call the carotids, all right, that are sensing blood pressure. If the pressure gets too high and you got too much pressure going up to the brain, they're going to cut it down. If you don't have enough pressure, they're going to raise the blood pressure. But you have sensors all over your body that are just sensing what's going on and sending information back to the control center, which is usually the brain, can be the brain stem, the spinal cord, because some of these reflexes that we'll learn about are very quick and don't have to go back to the brain for processing. But that information about the change in environment is sent back to our control center, back to our brain. The brain goes through that information, decides, yeah, I don't need to react to this change. Yes, I do need to react to this change. So it depends on what the brain, information that is going to the brain, what's going to happen. And if a change needs to be affected, it sends out the command to the effectors that change that particular homeostatic mechanism. So there's going to be some response. All right. So again, if your sugar is running too low, that information is going to be sent to the brain. The brain is going to say, your sugar's too low. We need to provide more sugar. Information is going to go to the liver. The liver is going to start to convert the glucose storage molecules that it has and send it out into the bloodstream. And again, we'll talk about that in AP2. That's more physiology. So homeostatic mechanisms and keeping homeostasis is really primarily a physiology mechanism. So we'll talk about that a lot in AP2. This is not precise, as I mentioned. It's not like a little tiny set point. And I like the example here of the air conditioner. When you put your thermostat on 72, that's not what, it doesn't stay at 72. I mean, most of us know when you set that set point, oh, it's getting a little warm in here, and you hear the air conditioner kick on, and then you start to cool off, and then it's like, oh, it's getting a little cold in here, and then you see the air conditioner cut off. So there's a range that's set, and the body works the same way. And most of that is done using what we call negative feedback. This is the most common type of homeostatic mechanism, and basically where you're going to return the condition back towards normal range. Okay, it's called negative, as it says, because the response to the change moves it in the opposite direction of the way it moved. Okay, so you've got, just like the example that I gave you with the glucose drops too low, you're going to make a positive response by putting more glucose into the system. If you have a too high level of something, i.e. blood pressure or body temperature, the body will try and drop it back down. So it's going to go the opposite direction from what it is sensing. Positive feedback is exactly the opposite. This is fairly uncommon, but this is where you want to double down on that change, if you will. This is very short term in terms of how long it works, but things like blood clotting. You get a cut and you clot, and you want to keep clotting until that wound is sealed. Those that are females are really familiar with uterine contractions, but the hormone oxytocin causes these uterine contractions. When labor starts, oxytocin is secreted. This causes harder uterine contractions, which causes more oxytocin to be secreted, which causes harder uterine contractions. And so you're doubling down on that reaction. Okay. All right. How this body is organized. We're going to look at some of this and start talking about this now. Now we're getting into really some of the A and P and some of the terminology that we have to learn. The body is made up of what we call two main portions, and that is the axial portion and the appendicular portion. The axial portion is the head, the neck, and the trunk, whereas the appendicular are the limbs. All right. And when we look at this, we divide the axial portion into these major cavities. It helps us identify things. It helps us identify where organs are. The major cavities, the cranial cavity, which is the brain, the vertebral cavity, vertebral canal, spinal cavity, has many different names. That's going to have your spinal cord. The thoracic cavity, your chest, lungs, and the heart are in there. And then you have the abdominal pelvic cavity, which is divided into the abdomen and the pelvic cavities. So those contain both those areas. Dividing the thoracic cavity and the abdominal pelvic cavity is the diaphragm. We'll show that in this picture coming up. Basically you have an area in the thoracic cavity between the lungs that contains the heart and the trachea in that area. It's called the mediastinum, the middle of the sternum, if you want a little interpretation there. And again, the abdominal pelvic, two portions. The abdominal cavity, which is from the diaphragm to the top of the pelvis, that top of that hip bone, and then the pelvic cavity is enclosed within that pelvic bones or those hip bones. So if we take a look at this, you can see this. This is the cranial cavity, obviously containing the brain. You have the vertebral canal cavity, the thoracic cavity, there's your diaphragm, which is dividing this abdominal cavity from this pelvic cavity here, but this whole cavity abdominopelvic. Okay, and this is a sideways view, and this is a front-on view so that you can see the difference. All right, so looking at the head itself, you have several cavities within that cranial cavity. You have the oral cavity, which contains the mouth, the nasal cavity, the nose, the orbital cavities, the eyes, and a middle ear cavity, which obviously contains the ear. Okay. When you look at some of these cavities, particularly the thoracic, abdominal, pelvic cavity, they do have membranes. This is a double layered, what we call serous membrane. It secretes this fluid. Serous fluid is a lot like plasma. If you've ever seen plasma, it's kind of light yellowish. It's very slippery, and it's very important, and we'll talk about this in a second. But you generally have two layers. So you have the visceral layer, which covers the organ. That's that inner layer. And the parietal layer, which lines the wall of the cavity. So this stays consistent throughout A&P. So anytime you have two layers like that, the inner layer will be the visceral layer, the outer layer will be the parietal layer. Some examples is around the lungs, around the heart, around the abdominal pelvic cavity, okay, and those organs. So we're going to take a look at these layers. All right, so I like this example. Here's your pericardial cavity. All right, so this is your heart, and this would be the membranes around the heart. Okay, it's as if you took your fist and put it into your other hand. So you've got two layers here. All right, you've got a layer, the inner layer, which we said was the viscera. You have a visceral layer, and you have the other layer, which is the parietal layer. In between those layers, you're going to have a fluid, and that fluid helps us reduce friction. It allows us, it just basically allows the organ to move, to contract, that sort of thing, to go in and out as we breathe. So those organs that are moving, like the heart and the lungs, that sort of thing, are going to have this type of membrane around it, so we don't burn the organs up as we develop friction in the body. Okay, all right, so you can see some of these. So if we look at this cross section, you can start to see these membranes. You can see this membrane around the lungs. You can see the membrane around the heart. So again, the membrane touching the organ here and here is going to be your visceral, and the one on the outside, the parietal, and in that little space would be a fluid. Around the heart, pericardial fluid. Around the lungs, pleural fluid. Continuing on, we're going to look at organ systems now that we've talked about the membranes, and we have some basic systems that we have. Integumentary system. This is the skin. And so obviously it is very protective. It helps us regulate temperature. It has a lot of sensors. We'll be talking about that very shortly. Skeletal system. This is bones. You're going to need to know the names of the bones. You're going to need to know the nooks and crannies on the bones. But this is our framework of the body. It is also going to be storage of calcium and phosphorus, and it helps it produces those blood cells in the bone marrow. So we'll be looking at that. The muscular system allows us to move. We're going to be looking at muscles. We'll talk about that. So those are those basic systems. Also in this course, we're going to talk about the nervous system. How do we communicate from the brain to the sensory receptors that we talked about, back up to the brain? How do we respond? This is our control system, so we'll be looking at that. When you get to AP2, you'll be talking about the endocrine system. This is hormones. This is really the chemical control of the body with chemical messengers. Okay? Cardiovascular system, the heart, the blood, getting that circulation, that transport. You also have another system called the lymphatic system, which runs alongside the cardiovascular system. It transports what we call lymph from the tissue to the blood. It is where our antibodies circulate, so it is very much our immune system. Okay? You're going to get in AP2 also the digestive system, respiratory system, urinary system. So we're going to be breaking down food, we're going to be removing the waste, and we're going to be doing that using the oxygen that we're going to be breathing in. The reproductive system, again, AP2, we're going to look at male and female reproductive system and how that occurs, how we make sperm cells, how we make ova, that sort of thing, and how that baby develops. All right, so the first thing we have to do when we start talking about the body is start talking about the names. And this is where people run into issues. This is kind of tough for some people, but what you have to, where we start is what we call anatomical position. If I face you and I say it's on your right, which is your right? Is it my right or your right? So what we do is we make a standard position that is always used, all right? And that is anatomical position. And anatomical position means you are standing upright, face forward, upper limbs at the sides, palms out, feet together, feet facing forward. And any positional word that we use after this point uses this as the absolute gold standard reference. All right. So anything we're looking here at the body, this, and we're going to refer to it, this will be the left side, this will be the right side. So any organ that is in the body, this side of it will be the left side, this side of it will be the right side. We'll start to talk about that. But you have to realize that this is standardizing so that you can make sure, so like when you take an x-ray, the doctor knows which lung you're looking at. Are you looking at the left or are you looking at the right? So it becomes very, very important. Now we have specific names for these locations in the body. You do need to learn these. This is one of the worksheets that I've given you. It is important. You will be using these and referring to these as we go through the different units, as we go through the skeletal system, as we go through the muscles. But you need to know these. Some of these are going to be very familiar with you, like cephalic and cranial, oral, but you may not be so familiar with antecubital, for example. That's where your blood's drawn. Most people are pretty familiar with carpal tunnel syndrome, in the wrist, sorry. But some of you guys may not be familiar with, we call the thumbs the pollex, the big toe is the hallux, those kind of things. So those words you do need to learn. So in terms of positioning, when we go through this, what we're looking at is we're using this anatomical position. So we have directional terms that tell us where things are. Anything above a point is superior to it. Anything below, inferior. Anything towards the front, anterior. Anything to the back, ventral. We also use the terms posterior or dorsal. So anterior, ventral, posterior, dorsal. All right, so if I'm looking at myself, I would say my head is superior to my chest. All right, the spine is posterior or dorsal to the chest. If I'm talking about the front of an organ, it's anterior or ventral to the back of it. When we talk about on the sides, we have medial and lateral. So if you're moving towards the medial, towards the midline, if you're going laterally, you're moving away from the midline. So if you've got a bone, like your leg, and you've got a bump on the outside and you got a bump on the inside, which you're going to have to learn, we call them like the lateral epicondyle or the medial epicondyle. So those tell us which sides of the bone or which side of the organ it may be. If you have paired structures, we'll say they're bilateral. If they're on the same side, we say they're ipsilateral. If they're on opposite sides, they are contralateral. Okay, so if one organ is on one side of the body and the other organ is on the other side of the body, they're contralateral to each other. All right. If we have something like a limb, this is where we usually use these. We'll use the term proximal and distal, and that's closest to the point of attachment and furthest from. So when I sit there and I look at my hand is distal to my upper arm, okay, because it is further from the point of attachment, which is the shoulder. If you have fingertips and you look at your fingers, we call these the bones phalanges. The end of the finger will be the distal phalange. The bone that is the phalange that is right next to your wrist will be the proximal phalange. So we use these terms so we know where everything is. Superficial, deep. The surface of something, superficial, the deeper into the body itself. All right, so we can see this by looking at this. Here's our midline. This is again our left side, because we said it's in anatomical position. She is in anatomical position. This is the left side. This is the right side. This is proximal because it's towards that point of attachment, which is the shoulder. And this is distal because it's away. All right. Anterior ventral, the front, posterior dorsal, the back, and this would be superior and inferior. So I've got a worksheet for you guys that kind of takes you through this, and you kind of get used to using these type of words. The other thing that we look at is when we actually look inside the body. For example, we get a CT scan or we get an x-ray, we're going to look at these in sections. When they go and look at tissues in histology, when you have a surgical specimen that comes down to the pathologist to look at, they're going to do different sections. And we have names for how it is sectioned. Okay, we have the sagittal, the transverse, and the coronal or frontal sections. And again, you've got another worksheet on this. But sagittal means we are going right down the body, dividing it into left and right portions. If they are even and you're right down the middle, we call it a mid-sagittal section. All right. If it is not equal, we call it parasagittal. But you're going to divide whether it's the organ or the body into left and right. A transverse section divides it into upper and lower, or superior and inferior. All right, the coronal section is going to divide it into anterior and posterior. A lot of people use coronal because you think of a crown on your head. You put that crown up on that head, and you've got a front and a back, if you will, of that head. So that kind of helps you remember, the coronal. So if you take a look at this, this again is a very typical picture of what this looks like, and it depends on what kind of section is being made, what it looks like. This looks totally different from this, because this is what? A sagittal section. You're cutting it right down, so you're seeing part of that head, versus cutting it across and you're getting a transverse section. All right. So a lot of times when you're trying to look at organs or something like that, you're going to get transverse sections. If a doctor wants a particular view, they're going to tell you what kind of section they want. All right. Or if you ever see a report of some of these procedures being done, it says so many sagittal sections were done, blah, 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 blah. And that just tells you how these were cut. Okay. So you can take a look at the difference between, here's a brain cut with a mid-sagittal section, a transverse section, and a frontal section. Look totally different. So it depends on what you're trying to look for and what you're trying to look at, which section is used. Other sections that may be used is a cross section. That's across that structure. Oblique, you're going across it, but you're going at an angle. And then longitudinal, you're taking that long cut down lengthwise. And sometimes for particular x-rays, you may be using those. The other thing that we use to help us identify are these abdominal regions and quadrants. Patients come in with belly pain. I mean, that's, belly pelvic pain. What's going on? All right, so what we do is we use certain terms to give us an idea of, where is the pain. So we may use a quadrant, or we may use these basically abdominal regions. So when we talk about a quadrant, we're dividing it into 4 sections. I can't get my mouse to work, right? So we have the 4 sections. We have the left and right. So this is always the left side, always the right side. You have a left upper quadrant, right upper quadrant, right lower quadrant, left lower quadrant. And this will pretty much tell us a lot of times, traditionally, you come into the emergency room with an appendicitis. It's right lower quadrant pain. So there are certain organs that are under these quadrants that tell you, well, if you've got gallbladder pain, you're not going to generally have pain in the left lower quadrant. It's going to be in the right upper quadrant. Well, sometimes we need a little more definition to help us figure out exactly where this is. And so instead of doing 4 quadrants, we do 9 regions. And you can see the names of these. So we've got the left hypochondriac, chondrocartilage. Okay, so this is underneath the cartilage of the lung. The epigastric, right over the stomach. The right hypochondriac. Then you have the left lateral. You may hear this as iliac. Sometimes different textbooks change the name. You have the umbilical region, pubic region, inguinal, and inguinal. So some of these change a little bit depending upon the textbook you're using. Okay, so that's the end of our first chapter. And I wanted to do a full chapter so that you see what it's like. And what I want you to be doing is hopefully you're going to be working with your guided notes along with this. You do have guided notes, the frame notes that you are supposed to be filling out from these PowerPoints. Now, from now on, I'm not going to be doing the entire chapter. I'm going to expect you to go through those guided notes and go through this chapter one by one by one, page by page. But I will be doing an abbreviated PowerPoint discussion because there's going to be some areas that are going to be really, really, really hard to do. And I'm going to want you to listen to those and really understand, because once we get to the physiology, it's going to be much, much tougher. But you're going to have those guided notes. And then in addition, I have the laboratory practical information. I'm going to be doing some voiceovers on the laboratory PowerPoints to help you guide you through that, because I want you to have the laboratory experience where you're going to be looking at those things. So between the two, you should be doing that. Now on the laboratory stuff, their drop and drag, I can't talk today, their drop and drag, and that means you can take it multiple times. The idea is the more times you work with this, the more times you practice it, the more times you write these words down, the better you'll remember it. You can't expect yourself with anatomy and physiology to glue this stuff in one run through and I've got it down, unless you've got a photographic memory. But most of us, it will take several run-throughs for us to learn this material. So expect to do that several times. Expect to do that and then study on this. Okay, so we'll see you in the next chapter. Actually, we'll see you in the lab. And have a good semester, and I hope you're enjoying it.